Greetings, everybody. Welcome to History at Night. I'm Bryan McAuley, the site manager at San Felipe de Austin State Historic Site, and I'm joined tonight by my colleague, Barbara Judkins, who is the site manager at the Starr family home. One of the great things about being connected to a site that has an early footprint in the stories of Texas that we love is that I have a number of unique connections to some of my colleagues and the sites that they operate. And one of the ones that I found pretty early and was happy to explore with Barbara, and as I've mentioned to my crowd here in the audience tonight, we're still exploring this story. We have plenty to know, plenty to learn that we don't know yet. But we navigated our understanding that Travis's last law partner ends up being the person who begins the ball of preservation rolling so that the Travis diary can exist today. I'm going to move on so I'm not going to read you slides tonight, but I'll give you some things to look at as we start this program. What this program tonight is not going to be is a heavy psychoanalysis of what Travis says about himself and others, right? We'll leave that to any of you that choose to read his diary. I'm no more equipped at that than anybody else in the scheme of things, other than understanding some of the history that he tells us about. Instead, we want to share with you the amazing part as we see it in the title of this program is the fact that the diary exists at all today and that it can be something you can utilize as a resource. So we want to tell you what we know about that story. As you can see on the slide that I currently have up, William Barrett Travis arrived in San Felipe in 1832. Any of you that know anything about his story know that he's already had some hiccups in the town of Anahuac. He's already gotten on the radar of Mexican officials and others for stirring pots over there, and has decided to move his law practice to the town of San Felipe. Pretty quickly after he arrives, he becomes the secretary of the town council, or the ayuntamiento. Did participate in the siege of Bayard in late 1835 after being elected as a delegate to the consultation that begins a war government. So he's choosing to be a soldier in that moment instead of a politician. The diary, if you're not familiar with it, hopefully you'll get a nice little bit of insight tonight into the fact that it exists and some of what it does. Although again, I said the story is mostly going to be about how it remains available to us today. But the diary is basically 10 months or so of his life that took place here in the town of San Felipe de Austin, kept between August of 1833 and June of 1834. I always get a rise out of people in a positive way when we talk about Travis's death at the Alamo and the impact of that here. And I'll ask people, how old do you think William Barrett Travis was when he died? And if you know it in the audience, quiet for people at home, but Travis was 26 when he died fighting at the Alamo. So he started this diary just after his 24th birthday, and it ends before his 25th birthday. So there's a lot of speculation about whether there are other diaries, whether he's a lifelong journalist. I always find it interesting that Travis alludes to writing his own biography, essentially creating an autobiography of himself at some point that is referenced by other people, so it seems to have existed. I know history friends who wish that it were still around today instead of the diary, because it might be more compelling in terms of what we would learn about Travis. Anyway, to give you a sense of how my site connects to Barbara's and how we get into this core preservation story, you see there the newspaper ad on the screen. In late 1835, again, we've already had the battle at Gonzales, come and take it has taken place. You have a war government formed here at San Felipe that has not chosen to declare independence, but is instead justifying taking up arms against the federal Mexican government. And in all that crazy window, a young man who comes to us from Ohio by way of Georgia with his young bride, who was very pregnant when he arrives in Texas. His name is Franklin Jefferson Starr. And in a weird moment of strange connection, he becomes Travis's last known law partner right before Travis goes to his fate at the Alamo. So in the ad, Barbara and I talk a lot about the poor Mr. Nibbs, who's being dismissed in this ad. He was the last law partner, and there are some footprints of his story that we've been able to find, although not a lot. So Mr. Starr shows up. He was a practicing attorney in Georgia before he came here, so that clearly is the profession he was chasing. And for whatever reason, whatever the fallout was with Travis and Nibbs, whatever was the moment that caused Travis to recognize he needed a new law partner, at least part of that is undoubtedly connected to the fact that Travis knows he's about to be out of town for a while. He's not going to be here. So I've always enjoyed the last sentence of this ad that says, one or both of them will be constantly found in their office at San Felipe. Well, guess which one it's not going to be? So William Barrett Travis is barely at all in his law office after these ads start running. Fire, Barbara.
Okay, so let me interject a little bit about Franklin Jefferson Starr and Dr. James Harper Starr. And when they were in Georgia, they actually decided to move to Texas. So about a year before Franklin and his wife Pamela came to Texas, he came to Texas with a man named Amasa Spencer and hung around down around Independence. So, and several Georgians also came to Texas at that time. I don't have their names, but Dr. Starr's memoir says it. That's his primary source. So, but they clearly intended to come. Dr. Starr was on his way with his wife to join his brother and sister-in-law in Independence or San Felipe. There was kind of they couldn't decide where they were going to go. So they kind of decided, I think Franklin decided to come on to San Felipe, but they came to join them, but they didn't make it because of the revolution kind of blew up about the same time they were on the road. So they bivouacked in Alabama for about 10 months. And then came on, when they found out it was safe to come to Texas, they came to Texas and they joined his brother in Nacogdoches. So,
and as you can see, the bullet that we left there about Dr. Starr, the younger brother of Franklin Jefferson Starr, is that he becomes a prominent official in the Republic pretty quickly. So he's serving in the Mirabeau Lamar administration, the second presidential administration of the Republic. So I want to give you just some real quick geography related to this sort of accidental discovery or accidental journey of the diary. So this is a tight crop of the plat of the town of San Felipe de Austin. And just so you're aware, what I'm trying to show you here, obviously, there are a handful of things. The blue square, for those of you that are sitting with me here in the room at the Visitor Center at San Felipe, that represents this building. So that's where we are in the context of the downtown part of the town. And the plat is much larger than this, although this covers a lot of what was actually developed in the history of the town. The red square, many of you that have come and visited and explored this story here know this and have seen it. The red square is Town Lot 50, which is just outside these doors behind me and to my left. And that is the believed location of the last William Travis law office. So at the time that the town is destroyed, that's where the Starr and Travis law office would have been located by our understanding. Travis did move his law office. It was not the only location he had a law office, but we've done a pretty good job of tracing down why we think that's the location. It's a site that we will explore, certainly archaeologically in the future, see if we can find any additional evidence that connects us to a law office. The building had been used in various ways. And so one of the things we have discovered at the site of Lot 50 is set type that we know belonged to the first printer in town, who originally rented a building across the street, across FM 1458, and then moved to Lot 50 to run his print shop. So the Travis law office would have been a later tenant in that same shop. We know the printer is long gone by then, so there's no potential conflict in the use of that building in the historic record there. But that's where we are. So that Travis law office is just right outside this building if we have those dots connected just right. The blue line, especially for those of you that are local at all, represents FM 1458 as it approaches the Brazos River, but it also aligns with the historic roadway for about that 3.5, 4 block stretch. When you get to the Park Road, it starts to deviate pretty quickly. But for this little stretch right across from us, that's pretty accurate. And then the yellow star that I put on here represents where the government is operating, the war government that Travis is communicating with. And for those of you who've been out to see our new outdoor exhibit, the Via de Austin, that lot is the lot that we've recreated that had, we think, the building used as a courthouse on it and the Farmers Hotel and these structures that are being utilized by the government as they're trying to fight this war against the Mexican government. So obviously, Travis, once he's been assigned to the Alamo, finds himself somewhat unexpectedly in command of that garrison. And then before certainly he expected, and I think most Texans expected, finds the town of San Antonio and the Alamo under siege by Santa Anna's advanced forces. And so you get a couple of letters in late February, the first on the 23rd, which basically just says, wow, they're already here. sends a letter here letting people know that things are heating up in San Antonio. And then, of course, what's considered the most famous letter in Texas history by many people, the victory or death letter written on February 24th, in which Travis predicts the story of the Alamo. I need men, I need supplies, I need guns. If we don't get it, we're all going to die here fighting for your freedom, that kind of thing. So that letter is sent here, departs the Alamo compound on the 24th, arrives on the 27th. And I always tell people, the former curator of the Alamo, Bruce Winders, likes to say, Travis's letter couldn't build an army to save the Alamo, but it built the army that won San Jacinto. And I would always say to Bruce, that is just so close to 100% accurate. I'm going to fix that just with one little thing, because very few people saw the Travis letter. Oh, sorry, my face is half on for the people at home. Apologies. Yeah, I don't have a good half. So when the letter gets here, the most famous printer in early Texas history, Baker and Borden's, the shop here run by Gil Borden, they print the letter as a broadside. And that then goes out. That's what motivates the building of Sam Houston's army functionally, is the people seeing the broadside document. But of course, here in San Felipe, this is where the letter is sent by messenger. This is where it arrives. It stops in Gonzales on the way, but then it arrives here. And here you've got Mr. Starr, who's just signed up with this guy as a business partner, hearing that his partner who's commanding the Alamo is under siege and needs help. So not surprisingly, he enlists and joins up with the militia when they muster in response to Travis's letter. So that muster happens on February 29th. I was way too old to admit when I figured out the reason I couldn't count 13 in the 13-day siege of the Alamo is because 1836 was a leap year. So there's the 29th of February you got to account for in there. So the militia musters here. Many of you know this story of what we call the San Felipe flag, designed by Stephen F. Austin as a potential independence banner. And then sort of, I think maybe to honor Austin, Gil Borden, the printer again, has the flag design made as the militia banner for the men that are mustering here to try to go to Travis's aid initially. And that's when it gets the motto, our country's rights or death. So the flag is presented to the men near the Peyton's Tavern off the business square on the 29th of March. And Barbara and I were kind of jockeying back and forth. I think he probably has it right. I was speculating a little bit, but Franklin Jefferson Starr kept us a short journal of his activities coming to Texas and kind of where he was. And he says that they march out with the militia on March 1st, which makes sense in the scheme of them mustering on the 29th and then maybe leaving the next morning. I also include there for you that broadside of the Travis letter, so you can see what's coming out of the print shop when they're trying to get the word out. They make it to Gonzales, in a handful of days. They get there near the end of the first week of March, and Baker's men, Baker's company, join a growing sea of confused and concerned citizen soldiers who are showing up with their own leadership, hoping that they can help in some significant way, but fearing they're either too late or that things are going south on a schedule that they can't change, that things are going to not turn out well. And so Starr's there with the men. They're there when Sam Houston arrives after he's given his commission by the independence government at Washington, right? So the government moves in March. It's not here anymore. They go to Washington on the Brazos to declare independence. And Sam Houston, who signs that Declaration of Independence on his birthday, March the 2nd, is then commissioned as the commander-in-chief of a mostly non-existent enlisted army. And he goes out into the field, ends up arriving at Gonzales around the 10th of March, I believe, to take command of the army. And at that point, they're fairly confident that the Alamo's fallen. They confirm that pretty quickly. So in Mr. Starr's story, one of the wonderful things that Barbara and I found at the Briscoe Center at the University of Texas, doing some research there over the years, is this handwritten receipt where Mosley Baker, the militia captain that I mentioned to you, is accepting the weapon that Franklin Starr was carrying as he served in the militia, basically in exchange for his furlough, or not necessarily exchange, but he's telling him, yes, your pregnant wife is back at home. I get that. We're hearing things aren't going well on the Western frontier. Starr felt like he needed to come back here to take care of his wife and to keep her safe in the scheme of things. And so he's signing over the rifle, which Barbara and I also enjoyed. We were just connecting these dots this week. Mr. Starr says in his journal that he is renting a building for them to live in from Thomas Gay, who was a fairly prominent landowner here in town. He owned several lots and several buildings at that time. And so you can see here that Baker says that the weapon had originally been owned by Mr. Gay. So obviously his landlord sent him off with a gun, whether he loaned it or owned it or however it happened. And as Starr is leaving Gonzalez and leaving the militia that he's just joined, he's asked to leave the weapon behind because it may be needed by someone who shows up without, or just because of the dearth of weapons potentially as they move into this battle. So that's on March the 17th. You can see that date there at the top of the document. And so things start heating up fairly quickly. You know, March 17th is about the time, Chandler can call me on this, that the government is disbanding at Washington, right? Because they're getting nervous about Mexican army movement and how things are happening there. And so Sam Houston is going to begin his retreat here shortly, but slightly ahead of that, you now have Franklin Jefferson Starr coming back without his militia, without his company, to San Felipe de Austin.
And his wife is 7 months pregnant. So it's not a little pregnant, it's a lot pregnant. So that may have been a big deciding factor for him to come back.
I've always felt like he probably starts thinking this through in his head even before he gets to Gonzalez. Was this the right thing to do? Should I have left the wife and she knows nobody and I'm trying to help out my law partner and build a new nation or whatever? So according to his journal, they arrived back on the 18th. We've kind of gone back and forth on that. If the receipt's signed the 17th, he's hoofing it to get back here the next day, even if it's early on the 17th and late on the 18th. It could be done, but he's really moving. So somewhere around the 18th, he ends up back here in town. And then the next entry in the journal, if I remember correctly, Barbara, is that the day? Oh, I'm talking about, I thought on the 20th, he says they're headed to Nacogdoches.
No, that's what further down.
Okay, so he's definitely here before Sam Houston's army. He's evacuating, there's already parts of the runaway scrape have begun. People are fleeing now that they know the Alamo's fallen, and people are concerned about where the battles are going to take place. But we know Starr is back here before the bulk of the army. He may be witness to other people trying to flee. He may be part of a migration as he's coming back from Gonzalez and bearing witness to some of that. This slide, I apologize, this is a stand-in. This is one of our buildings out in the V. I'm just kind of showing you what buildings look like in town. That's my stand-in for the Travis Law Office, because one of the things that Starr decides to do when he gets back to town is pack up the law office. Now, I don't know that I confirmed this for you, and I should have. When that receipt is signed on the 17th, they know the Alamo's fault, right? So there was speculation when Sam Houston arrives. When he's leaving the militia, he knows his law partner is dead. He knows that there's been a drastic change in his life and in his operation. So he comes back here and essentially evacuates the law office 5 to 7, 8 days before the ultimate evacuation of town. Now understand, the residents that he comes back to have no idea that they're about to do the same thing. They don't understand that they're going to be evacuating this town and that they're going to be in a panic mode to flee. But he's coming back, taking care of the wife, and in the midst of that, packs up the law office. That other image, as you might have guessed, is a scan of the cover, the inside cover of the Travis Diary. And it says in it, Journal of William Travis, commenced, I think it says the 21st of August, 1835. I apologize, that's not a great scan, but that's in his hand telling you what the book is. Presumably, Franklin Starr has no idea that diary is in the collection, is in the books at the law office. He's just sweeping stuff off of shelves and off of desks and throwing them in boxes or however he's going to haul them out. But as a result, a diary that would have clearly been destroyed if it were in that building a week later ends up leaving with Franklin Starr and his wife to go to Nacogdoches. Many of you are likely aware in the 1960s, the diary was published. So we're jumping a lot of story that Barbara's going to fill in that involves how the Starr family makes it available in a way that it could be published. But you can see there, edited by Robert Davis, published in the early 60s. It's not in print currently. You can buy secondary market copies of it if you're interested in it. They tend to run, depending on who you catch and when, $40 to $100.
I was going to say you're going to need a second job.
Well, we work for the state, Barbara. So anyway, this is what the book looked like in its original print. I think we got this, as you can see from the black binder. This is our research collection copy, and it was out of a school library. I'm pretty sure that's how we ended up with a copy. That's not an uncommon way for them to end up on the secondary market. It's often noted, people that have seen the diary will bring this map up when they come visit me, which was included as one of the companion pieces inside the diary and projected as a bird's eye view of the town of San Felipe. So don't get confused, for those of you that know where we're standing right now. This is looking south. So the river is in the foreground, right? You might be thinking it should be flipped. It's like a game of horseshoes where you get points for being within 10 feet of the stake. There's some things that are kind of close. There's some things that are clearly not particularly accurate. There's a density that gets missed in the scheme of things, but it's an interesting effort, and I give the artist some credit. It's certainly an appealing looking thing. It feels like it's conveying some good information to you. And on the list there of what the buildings that are identified are, there are some interesting ones that we chase as well, including the Farmers Hotel, which Barbara and I were looking at earlier. I'm pretty sure is on the wrong side of the square based on how our archaeology has found the Farmers Hotel. But anyway, it was an interesting aspect of trying to show people the geography of this story. And so we thought we'd share it with you. If you've never seen it before and you end up with a copy of the diary or borrowing one in the future, you'll stumble across that. Sorry, one last thing I wanted to do. Again, we're not here to analyze the diary. There's a lot of content in it. Like most diarists, Travis alludes to a lot of things that you can kind of connect and you can make sense of. He's also maddeningly short on information where you're like, man, if you just told me 2 more names and what street that was and where you could really start connecting things. But diaries are generally written for an interior audience. So he's writing to someone who knows the story, and his shorthand leaves us wanting in some places. When it was published in the 60s, the diary got a lot of acclaim, and rightly so, for the extensive footnotes that editor Davis did to help give readers context. Who's he talking about? Where were these stories taking place? We know a lot more now, but it certainly was a good start 60 years ago to getting this story out there. I'll tell you just in brief, Travis, I mentioned he becomes the secretary of the town council when he's here. And I think he's actually started the diary before that happens. That's an easy thing to fix and to know, and I should have locked it down. But I don't think becoming the town secretary motivates him to become a diarist. Those 2 parts of his life do overlap. He's keeping notes and minutes for the town council. At the same time, he's running this journal. And there's a lot of his journal that sounds like a business ledger. Barbara and I were talking earlier saying it's kind of like a planner. He's telling people what he did and where he's going to be. And if he has to go back and refer to his own notes to say, oh yeah, I met with a client that day. I know who I was talking to. I remember the case that we were working on. There's a lot of that. There's also some aspects of his social life. Many of you that are local know that Travis had a girlfriend who lived up on Mill Creek when he was at the Alamo. There's a lot of allusion to the Cummings family and to his interactions with Rebecca, the girlfriend, in the diary. I think most people who've analyzed this from an historical perspective have it right. The first reference to the Cummings family, which I think he says he's going to dinner or stops for dinner in September, the 2nd month of the diary, it's pretty clear he already knows the people. It's not like an aha moment where I met this family and wow, they've got a really attractive sister that might be someone I'm interested in. That's not part of the entry. So seemingly they already know each other, which makes sense. The Cummings family were business people in the area and in the community. They had been here, they're old 300. They were working with Stephen F. Austin on the front end. And if you're not aware, they're running a sawmill up on Mill Creek. So they were doing things to help foster the community. They also ran what was frequently called a house of amusement or a tavern. So they're inviting people out to socialize if you're traveling through the Mill Creek area. So they were popularly known. Travis seemed to know them. If you've heard the rumors, yes, Travis does talk a lot about his relations with women who are not his wife and are not Rebecca and that kind of thing. He does sort of tally conquests, as it were. So there's some caddishness to his diary in that regard. He also talks about gambling. He was a frequent card player as part of his social life. So he'll talk about whether he won tonight or lost tonight. And the geography of the diary tends to follow, for the most part, his circuit as a lawyer, where he's traveling town to town, doing court cases and things in different geographies, and reflects on some of that. One of the things that I found most compelling for someone who we established was 24 years old when he's writing this diary I would not have had this kind of vision, certainly at that age. There's at least 2 instances in the diary, maybe more, where he communicates about coming into a town. In at least one case, I know he knows the person. In another case, he might not. But he arrives in town and finds this sort of awkward hall where a prominent citizen is on their deathbed. And Travis takes it upon himself to sit with these men as they pass away over a day or two, feeling like they need someone to offer them comfort or attention as they're facing the end of their mortal life. And so it's interesting that that's something he's doing and that he's reflecting on in the course of the diary. All right, so I'm going to get them to Nacogdoches, them being Franklin Jefferson Starr and his wife Pamela and his very soon-to-be-born son. You can see there on the bottom, I say they arrived in Nacogdoches on the 1st of May. So they're leaving here around the 25th of March, 24th of March. I'm thinking, Barbara helped me with this earlier, with a 7.5-month pregnant wife, you're not moving real fast. So they're making their way to Nacogdoches. They may have made other stops that we're not as familiar with, but they end up in Nacogdoches in May. The son is born less than 3 weeks after they arrive and establish their footprint in Nacogdoches. And with that, well, sorry, we burned the town. So while they're en route to Nacogdoches, Sam Houston's army, of course, comes back. Baker's company is returning under their banner to the town that they marched out of to join this effort. Sam Houston's army arrives on March the 27th. On the 28th, officers come into town. They're resupplying through the stores. They're doing all kinds of things there. The next morning is when Houston announces, maybe it's the morning of the 28th, I apologize. Houston announces they're going to retreat to Grosses, which is a real shock to the system for the residents of town. Because in some ways, they're thinking, wow, there's all this terrible stuff going on. We just heard the Alamo's fallen, Santa Anna's en route, and then the cavalry shows up. Houston and all the army is here. They're on the edge of town. They're between us and the enemy, functionally. And that lasts a day. And then Houston says, we're leaving. And now all of a sudden, the citizens here are the front line. They've now become the line of defense. And things are a lot more confused and questionable. If you aren't familiar with the story, I'll take just a quick second to share it. Steve Smith, Houston's chief scout, who's here throughout the evacuation and burning of the town, claimed later that the biggest mistake he ever made as a scout, he was most embarrassed by, was announcing the need to evacuate San Felipe. When he did, this would have happened eventually. Sometimes when I tell this story, people get confused and say, oh, they didn't even need to burn the town. Well, no, the town was going to burn, but they didn't need to make the town's evacuation and burning a one-day event. So Smith thinks he sees the Mexican army on the horizon on the 29th. In fact, it's probably wild cattle or something else kicking up enough dust that that's what he thought the movement was. And so the word spreads very quickly. The militia start going house to house, telling people, pack up, get out, get across the river. We're burning this town tonight. And so that becomes the end game chapter of the destruction of the town. By the way, yesterday was the anniversary of the burn. So happy New Year. We're moving on to the next year of commemoration. And of course, at that point, then you've got these people lined up trying to cross the river. This is actually an old slide I took out of a 1970s film strip, if you remember those, from Texas history. And I think they're evacuating Gonzales in that picture because nobody knew where San Felipe was or knew our story in the 1970s. But here we are trying to share with you that when our town is destroyed, Houston is going north for his 2-week excursion at Grosses, and the Starrs are on their way to Nacogdoches.
So they went through Grosses. They were on the runaway straight for the better part of about 6 weeks. We have a large cache of letters in our collection, but none of them really mention this because Franklin died. Sorry. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. Franklin died way before. Sorry. Franklin died way before. Forgot what I was going to say. The letters start. And so really the only mention of Franklin we have is in Dr. Starr's memoirs that he wrote shortly before he died in 1890. He had been born in 1809. Both of the men had been born in Connecticut, grew up in Ohio, got the itch to get out of town and came to Georgia and then came to Texas. We have a pretty cute letter from their mother, Persia, that says, so Texas is hot and muggy and gross and it doesn't rain. Well, why don't you come back and be comfy in Ohio? And they're like, no, we don't think so. And they stayed. They're all buried in Texas. So, but their mother, I don't even know if she ever visited Texas, but she wasn't too thrilled. Probably not thrilled that her children were that far away, and certainly not thrilled that they were in somewhere that was really hot. But anyway, so when they get to Nacogdoches, Franklin, in the diary that Bryan and I found, are the little timeline he was keeping. Which side quest, when we were there that day researching, this student walks over to the desk and says, "I hear y'all have the Travis diary. Can I look at it?" And Bryan and I are like, "What?" And the lady goes, "I'm sorry, that's a very precious item. You have to have an appointment and you have to be approved to be able to have access." He goes, "Oh, I thought I could just see it." And I was like, wow, it wouldn't be here if everybody just could walk in and see it. So, but anyway, so when they get to Nacogdoches, not long after Franklin Starr's brother joined him, which is Dr. James Harper Starr, they had a little boy. His name was James Franklin Starr. So you're going to hear a lot of the same names when I talk about the Starr family, because they like to use the same name in every generation. There are 5 Pamela Orange Starrs. I talked to Harry McGee Leslie Spellings 4 once, and I said, "Is there a Leslie Spellings 5?" And he goes, "No, it's time for that name to die." So there's a lot. I talked to Dr. Starr's great-great-grandson the other day, and his name is James Harper Starr Pearson II. So I don't know how that would fit on a name tag. But when they get to Nacogdoches, they kind of live with a man named George Pollitt. Pamela and Franklin do. And George Pollitt was actually involved in the revolution as well. He had been appointed one of the commissioners to scare up the militia for when they needed it. So George Pollitt was probably a known name in San Felipe, and I don't know how Franklin and Pamela found his name, but somebody may have said, "Hey, if you're going to Nacogdoches, you may want to check in with the Pollitts. They may be able to help you." In later that year, on July 7th, 1837, unfortunately, Franklin Starr dies. He has gone out in July with a posse to run down some Indians, I guess, that were misbehaving, and died of heat stroke. So here we have Pamela Orange Starr, widowed with a son who's not even a year old yet. And when I first presented this program about the diary, I called it the long tragic journey of the Travis diary, because it does get tragic, because the little boy dies 2 years later. So this woman has lost her husband. She has had to run out of San Felipe. She's gotten to Nacogdoches. She loses her husband. She loses her son, and she's done with Texas. So right after that, she moved back to Massachusetts and lived the rest of her life there in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. She did write lots of letters back and forth to the family. She stayed in touch, very affectionate until we get to the Civil War. Then they were a little strained, and then they got affectionate again. But there were some pretty choice words, and they were very polite. But you could tell they were choice words. So Dr. Starr is now devastated. He's lost his brother and his sister-in-law. He's lost his nephew. His sister-in-law moves back to Massachusetts, and he's left to settle Franklin's estate. And when he does, he makes an inventory of the things, inventory and list of people who owe Franklin money. Am I going too long? Oh, yeah. Well, go back to the cemetery. Okay, I skipped around. Sorry. This is Franklin's gravestone. The little boy is actually buried in the same grave as he is. It's the oldest grave in Oakwood Cemetery in Nacogdoches. And they're the only 2 Starrs buried there, but the Starr family lived in Nacogdoches for 30 years. The rest of them managed to survive and make it to Marshall. They're all buried there. So that's the only 2 Starrs. But if you go there, you see that little brown sign, you can see that from way across the cemetery. So if you ever go to the cemetery in Nac, you'll find it real fast.
Drop the second R, there's a typo on the
Well, that happens a lot, but when I had to type the word Starr, I put 2 R's on it.
I was just wondering if the story my oldest daughter very prominent Starr Avenue in Nacogdoches, if you all are familiar with the town, that is named after the family. That's part of their footprint there in the town. And I was just going to add, speculatively, when Pamela's leaving Texas, we presume there's already been some kind of separation of the legal, anything that's going to become part of the papers probably was not anything she was thinking about taking with her, right? So this is another moment where if she were really concerned about all of Franklin's law books and stuff, the diary might have left and it could have gone to parts unknown to Massachusetts. And who knows how it finds its way back to wherever at that point. But it seems pretty clear that with the arrival of the brother and his family and the unfortunate death of the infant, that's not something that she's invested in, or they've already compartmentalized some of the things to the point that they're not in discussion.
And at this point, Dr. Starr was pretty savvy business-wise, and he'd already settled several, or had helped settle several estates of family members and friends anyway. So he had a lot of experience. Plus, I have a feeling she probably just trusted him. So we're going to the next one.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is Dr. James Harper Starr and his wife, Harriet Johnson Starr. He was a trained doctor. He went to a school in Ohio for 2 whole years. Very nice. His grandchildren and his children and grandchildren described him as a really sweet, wonderful person. And as Mrs. Starr was too. Now, I have a fun, interesting little fact about Mrs. Starr. I want you all to look at me. Don't look at the screen, but look at me. Look right here. Her father and LBJ's great-grandfather were brothers. Now look back at her. You can see it. You can see it below the eyes. You can see the similarity. I tell the sentence that they're related to President Johnson, and some go, oh. So I get all sorts of different reactions, but that's kind of my little bit of fun during the day. But so they lived in Nacogdoches, had 5 children, 3 girls and 2 boys. And Nacogdoches was kind of thinning out in the 1860s. Kind of its heyday was over. I wish Dr. Starr could see it now. Awesome. But and there are letters going back and forth between him, Hayden Edwards, and all of that, saying we're all leaving. And a lot of the prominent citizens at the time period in the 1860s are leaving. So they moved to Marshall in 1870s. I'm sorry. They moved to Marshall in the 1870s, in 1870 actually. And the young man here, this is Frank Starr and his wife Clara. So the Starr family home is pretty much built around their house, which is a 1871 Victorian big house. It has 8 bedrooms. I don't know, a mansion. We have a fully decorated Victorian interior, and we have one of the largest collection of Victorian household items in the system. We have one other site that has a collection bigger than ours, and that's because they have a lot of paper. We are, the site manager and I, her name's Alicia, we kind of arm wrestle over who's got a bigger collection.
So to help you out with the name story again, Barbara and I go back and forth from a perspective standpoint. We did this a lot in the last few days. This is Dr. Starr's son, Frank, that I refer to as the nephew, because I'm viewing this from the Travis prism. So this is the nephew of Franklin Jefferson Starr, the law partner, the son of Dr. James Starr, the brother, right? Mm-hmm. So she calls him son, I call him nephew. Between the mix, we meet.
Dr. Starr, his name was James Harper Starr. He had 2 grandsons named James Harper Starr. Frank here is named after the baby that just passed away. So it gets very confusing. It took me years to get it all figured out. So when Dr. Starr died in 1890, he left a will, and he clearly delineated who got what amongst his 5 children. Well, actually 4 children, and then his children from his daughter Theodosia, who had passed away. And he says that Frank inherits a walking stick and some other stuff, and all of his personal pay and business papers. But he doesn't mention the diary. When Clara dies in 1925, she disinherits her son, her other son, twice in her will, but doesn't mention the Travis diary. So there's no mention of the Travis diary. I talked to some of the descendants, they've never heard of it either. And so we don't know if Dr. Starr found that diary, he obviously did, and stuck it into a folder with other papers and just left it there. We don't know why. Bryan and I speculate, and that's about all we can do. We have a lot of letters in the Starr family, and when one of Frank and Clara's daughters died, her name was Lily, he just writes a letter to tell his in-laws she had died. He didn't say what her symptoms was, what she died of, but that was very typical in that time period. You really didn't talk about those kind of personal things. So one of our ideas or suppositions is that maybe Dr. Starr perused the diary, or maybe he didn't and thought, this is the man's private thoughts, so I'm not going to look at it. I'm certainly not going to let anybody come in and look at it. I'll keep a secret.
Yeah, it's hard to say. If you've read the diary, and some of the diaries earlier where Travis kind of tattles on himself and some of his moral feelings, if that's the way to think about him. We could also make the case that if Dr. Starr had read the diary, maybe he was uncomfortable releasing that into the broader world of Texans who support and worship Travis as part of the story and champion him for his role in the revolution. But we don't know, and nobody's ever going to know in the grand scheme of things. You want to mention the inscription, which we just recently started kicking around?
Yeah, I don't even know if I can remember all the words.
I don't remember exactly how it's worded either. Sorry. Sure. One of the things we learned recently in this journey, not something we knew 10 years ago when we first started, is that there's some allusions to Dr. Starr, including an inscription in the diary that suggests Sam Houston ordered the saving of the diary, that somehow Sam shows up almost a week after the law office is evacuated, knows Travis kept the diary, and tells people to go save it. And there really can't be any truth to almost any of that. The weirder part of that story is that the Starrs, if you thought that was weird, this is something that my visitors sometimes are just like, it's an oh wow moment when I tell them, not everybody loves Sam Houston in the course of the story, right? The Starrs were in the group of people who really didn't love Sam Houston. They were not big supporters of Houston.
Dr. Starr was a little, I guess, maybe stuck up.
So it's interesting that, and of course, we don't know when it happened. Oh, do we start?
They had in Nacogdoches, they had land that adjoined each other, and Dr. Starr was a land guy. And there was
I meant we don't know when the inscription was at, right? So we don't have any idea. Is he doing this near the end of his life, where Sam Houston's reputation broadly is very positive? Barbara and I both kind of generally agree that it's trying to get on the right side of history, maybe to a degree, that Sam Houston is now a more revered historical figure than in the contemporary time when he was somewhat challenged and there was lovers and haters, although plenty of lovers and haters now too. So we don't really understand how that happened, but it's unusual that someone in the Starr family would tout Houston as the saving grace, particularly when the honest answer would have been, my brother did this. And he didn't know he did it, but my brother walked out of San Felipe with this diary, and as a result, you now can read it, or it's out for people. I'm sure Dr. Starr would have had no idea before his death in 1890 that eventually, of course, he didn't know it was going to be given to the state, but that eventually it would be available for public consumption. I'm sure he had no conceptualization of that whatsoever, whether he read the diary or not.
So this is where I work. Can you believe they pay me to work there? The staff and I are always surprised when we get our paychecks. We're like, woo, we had fun last week and they paid us for it. So, but this is called Maple Cross. It's the home of Frank and Clara Starr. It was completed in 1871. It's one of 6 historic structures we have on an acre, including a 1905 Queen Anne Victorian with nice gingerbread on it. But this house is fully furnished with artifacts from the family. 90% of everything inside the house is original to the house. So that's a pretty nice collection. It's not every time you get to go into a Victorian house of that age and have the original furniture sitting. in there as well. And it has been restored, so it's quite wonderful.
Are you ready to land this story?
Yep, let's land it. So this is a newspaper article. I woke up at 3 o'clock this morning, never went back to sleep. So I'm like, ugh. But yeah, thanks.
And drove here from
Marshall. So this is a newspaper story, a newspaper article we found this week. And if you look in the, point it out there. So it says that the diary is going to be taken to Dallas this week for the opening of the Hall of State at the Central Centennial Exposition on Saturday, which means the state had possession of that diary for like a month, and they're already taking it to be put on display. I mean, that was kind of a big splashy deal. And
so the donation is alluded to as coming from the engineer, Dr. Starr. We're not 100% sure who the motivators of this are. We certainly have come to think in finding these recent articles that the excitement of the centennial weighed on somebody, and that maybe, it can't have anything to do with the inscription, but the families, like I said, may have made a perceptive change of Sam Houston or whatever. But we were both intrigued to learn that the diary's first public showing took place on the stage of the centennial.
And there are a couple of articles that we have gotten from the papers from this time period, from 1935, and this one as well, where it states that the family just realized they had the diary a few months before they donated it. I guess everybody in that family were not nosy Nellies. He had 6 daughters, so you would have thought they would have snuck into Papa's, library and snuck around or something, but undoubtedly those were very respectful children.
As historians, we want to find factual things we can share with you to tell these stories. Sometimes the things we don't know become the compelling part. But I'll tell you, as we've been guessing at this, I've been way off for most of the last decade, because I assumed that when Franklin Starr died in Nacogdoches, that Dr. Starr, fairly soon after in handling the estate, became aware of the diary. And now I think that's all in question. It's really not known. At what point does Dr. Starr become aware that they have it? What does he do with it? If he learns early, he seems to rat hole it away somewhere and kind of keep that as a secret. So as we were processing this today and thinking about centennials and the fact that we're now within 15 years, 13 years of a bicentennial, the diary functionally is lost for 100 years. It's held by someone, a family has it, and it ends up being protected enough that we can use it and see it today, but it's gone. It's out of any sort of realm of public interest or knowledge or preservation or perspective. So it's really fascinating that it could survive all that and be with us now.
Yes, and I was going to say something when you were talking about equivalent. It was, well, that went out of my brain. Sorry about that.
Well,
so we're going to, okay, so I had him put this in. This is a frieze that's above a door in the Hall of State at the State Fair. Have any of you ever been in the Hall of State Fair? This mural was painted by a man named Arthur Niendorf, who is Frank and Clara Starr's grandson and Dr. Starr's great-grandson. He was an artist his entire life, and he studied art and worked for Diego Rivera, and was at Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo's wedding, and there's a picture of him standing between them holding their marriage certificate, which is just another zinger I had to throw in for you guys to say, why do we have Starr family home? I'm like, well, I got 5 things to say about that. Oh, this is the quizzling thing I was going to tell you, and this is what I forgot to include. When Dr. Starr settled his brother's estate, he had a list of everything his brother owned, including saddles and books and debts people owed. That diary is not listed on any of those inventory lists, but there are 3 books in Spanish. One is about cattle, and I forgot what the other 2 are. If you've been following the timeline, Franklin grew up in Ohio. Not a lot of Mexican people lived in Ohio. Moved to Georgia, and then came to Texas, which is probably one of the first times he was exposed to Spanish. He didn't speak Spanish. So what's Franklin doing with books written in Spanish in his estate? Bryan and I think it's probably books that may have been taken from the law office. And by then, Franklin has been long dead, and Dr. Starr didn't know who they belonged to. So he probably just assumed they were part of Franklin's estate. I think that,
As opposed to making a connection to Travis.
Right, right.
He didn't see that.
it may not have dawned on him that those would have been Travis's. But I was thinking, I was like, exactly in the 3 weeks that Franklin was here before the Alamo happened, you know, when did he have time to learn Spanish fluently? I took Spanish in high school and college. I'm still not good at it. But anyway, I just wanted to throw this in kind of as an end note that we do preserve real places and tell real stories. And some of these stories are a little out of the norm, like this guy who was a portrait painter. But every site has these quirky little stories. So when you go to one of our sites, if somebody's giving you a tour, say, no, tell me the quirky story. You know, don't tell me what I want to hear, or tell me something new and funny and different. And they will keep you there for hours, I promise.
So we thought it'd be fun, and this is not kind of random, it's not super well organized, but we thought it would be fun to share with you the way we've approached some of the odd near misses that could have caused us to lose this diary. So, you know, first and foremost for me, when I first started exploring this story, I had the mistaken assumption that Starr might have chosen to leave the militia before they got to Gonzales. And so, despite seeing that receipt eventually, I was having a hard time connecting the timeline. And so part of my mindset was, well, if he comes back here not knowing Travis is dead, what would his motivation be to pack up the law office? But in fact, he knows Travis is deceased. So we're getting closer to figuring out some of these motivations. This is his livelihood. He is the Travis Starr law office because there's nobody left. Oh, but isn't there though, right? So Mr. Nibbs, who's still in town, we found a weird letter doing our research. And it's not even a letter. I was joking with Barbara today. This is 1835 emails text. This is him texting. Yeah, 1836 text. So he writes this note to Pamela, to Franklin Starr's wife, while Franklin is with the militia. So Mr. Nibbs clearly didn't join up. He's here in town. And he writes a letter.
On the 17th.
It's on the same day? It's on the 18th. Anyway, it's right in the same window, yeah. And so it's on the 18th. He says in the note, he refers to the bearer of the note. So he's writing this wherever his office or his home is, giving it to somebody and telling them, take this to her and tell her I need the keys to the law office, basically. So he's announcing that he's trying to tie up some ends. He's got some case documents, paperwork. He needs access to some stuff. He's trying to talk his way into the law office of his now deceased partner, or former partner, that we don't know if he thought maybe she'd be naive enough, or if he's actually trying to game this, or if he's trying to legitimately help people. It's unclear what his motivation is, but he's trying to navigate some presence with the Travis law firm that no longer has Travis as a partner. That's an odd part of the story.
Bryan and I were kicking around it today that I wonder if there are some other law office documents in the Starr papers. There's 41 linear feet of paper. I one time figured out how many pieces of paper that was. It was a lot. And I don't know if you know this, but people would write a letter, you know, and then they would turn it sideways. And they would write across this way. And then they would turn it over and write, and then write.
So the Starr papers, I think
it's hard to.
Papers and the diary are held today by the Briscoe Center of American History at the University of Texas, right? So Barbara helped me understand that the Starr family had some connections to both Dolph Briscoe in their lifetime, some of the descendant family, but also to the University of Texas. Dr. Starr claims at some point to have been involved in some of the planning and visioning documents related to the university's opening. And then his son becomes a regent, correct? So, and in fact, we're led to believe, I think you pointed out to me, Barbara, Dr. Starr was asked to serve as one of the first regents for the university system and declined because of his health. He was pretty advanced age at that point, and of course was living in Marshall, so he wouldn't have handled the drive as well as Barbara did today. So obviously, there's no speculation about this. Had the diary been left in the law office, if Franklin Starr had left with just his pregnant wife and whatever their personal possessions were, I think there's no doubt we would never know it existed. We would miss out on that story entirely. And obviously, when you are new to Texas, barely here, navigating a war, packing up stuff from here, going to Nacogdoches, where you're probably living in 2 or 3 places while you figure out your long-term game, the diary's shuffling around and all of that. And we're certainly convinced that Franklin Starr has no idea that he's got the diary. This is just boxes going places until ultimately they land. Starr's death contributes to the next chapter. We presume that lower bullet, I can't imagine anybody other than Travis knew he had a diary unless he was sharing it with really intimate connections like Rebecca or someone else. Although Barbara did mention that she could be right, the idea of it being a bit of a business planner, maybe Travis is carrying it around town with him. Maybe there are times he's making notes in front of people. Who knows? But by the time Starr is involved, we're a year and a half past the life of the diary. It hasn't had an active entry since 1834. So he's not watching Travis make any entries into it. There's nothing like that going on. We were talking over these last 2 points today. Presumably the diary being stored with the wider collection of the Starr family papers became its great salvation. That became its protection, either being hidden in plain sight or being part of a broader collective that the family valued, even if they didn't understand that they may have had the diary or what it could be. And then we certainly have now started connecting that the Starr family discovering it and navigating what to do with it right on the cusp of the centennial seems to have played a significant role in their decision to make it something that you all as Texans own and can celebrate.
So how did you like all those suppositions?
Based a little bit on fact. We'll be happy to answer questions. I apologize to those of you that are watching from home. I'm glad you get to do this in your pajamas. But if you want to send questions, please do it through the Q&A. Q&A? Yes, thank you. If you have questions in the room, yes, sir. Go ahead.
The property records stored in the law office.
Property records you mean for like the Austin's Colony?
Yeah, for the Austin Colony.
It's a different question, and I agree with you. I think I know where you're going. There's some. Oh, sorry. Yes, I will repeat that for our viewers at home. The question is, were the land records stored in the same place? And if I get this wrong, Jim, we'll clarify. There's some unique preservation stories. The Austin desk that we have in the museum, which also had to survive all this crazy of leaving the town, I believe it was being used functionally as a file cabinet of a lot of the prominent land administration papers. But to the direct part of your question, the land office was a separate operation. Travis was a private lawyer. He's just handling cases. You'd be surprised at how litigious this little town and Austin's Colony were. These guys are suing each other all the time. So right. So and nobody had any money, so they're making promises to pay for stuff, and they end up in court. There's just all kinds of reasons to go to court. I know many of you have heard me talk before. Just a crazy coincidence that the story of Celia Allen, which we're privileged to tell, as she receives her manumission as a formerly enslaved woman from a 3-headed business partnership here, that part of that process invokes Travis's representation multiple times. She's represented by Travis in legal proceedings. And he writes in the diary in December of 1833, retained by Celia, a free woman of color in the matter of her freedom. So there's some really compelling, unique things that show up if you know how to connect those dots and those nuggets. But the land office, the fact that those documents were saved is fabulous too. I will tell you, Jim, as opposed to a personal diary, the land documents existed in many different forms in many different places. So it's conceivable we could have rebuilt a lot of that if everything that was here had been lost, because there were records being sent to San Antonio and to Mexico City and those kinds
of things.
Yeah.
Instead of scanning them,
that's the Briscoe Center's job.
It was I did look into it. That's why I figured out how many pieces of paper were in there. I hope my boss has been watching. She's like, what did that woman do for an hour? But it's like $1 a page, or maybe it might be more now, because that was probably about 4 years ago. But some of that stuff is really hard to read. I mean, it's crazy nuts if you've ever seen those letters written like that. It just looks like a grid, like a wiggly quickly
She's
food.
certainly right. It would take a real industrious commitment to try to figure out, are there hints and suggestions of other things in those papers that are more connected to Franklin and his story here than to the later story? And my guess is if there are, they're very few, and they would be really hard to ferret out.
And we're also looking at ancillary collections, like Friends of the Stars, like they were friends with the Rust, with Thomas, with,
Yep, Tom
Yeah.
Sawyer.
and a lot of people in Nacogdoches who their collections are usually at SFA, Stephen F. Austin.
Go ahead, Frank.
Three Spanish books that you mentioned,
Mhm.
know where they are, and I assume there's no clue.
There is a clue. There,
Sorry. They asked if we know anything about what happened to the Spanish language books that were identified in Dr. Starr's probate.
well, yeah, when Dr. Starr was settling it, I told you he made the list. Well, when he sold those books, he wrote down the name of the purchaser. As a matter of fact, when he sold everything, he wrote down the name of the purchaser because he himself purchased his brother's bridle and stirrups and saddle.
I'm sorry to make that confusion. Starr's probate, this is him as he's living, processing out things that were in Franklin's probate.
Yeah.
So he did sell them.
Yeah, and he does have and I think about two of the names are easy to decipher. The other one might take a microscope or something with better eyes than I have.
But even at that, then you'd be talking about finding descendants who may have kept a book that's now have passed through 4 to 5 generations, right? So it's hard to know that we'll ever see those books again. Yes, go ahead, Nicole.
Audience at home. Related, we have a comment saying that some of those books may be Spanish law texts.
We have the same speculation that they may be law books. That'd be really obvious to me if there were Spanish language law books. Yeah.
One is about cattle.
Right.
One's about cattle. And the Stars did have cattle later, but I don't know.
And again, this is drifting into, is it possible those books were acquired later for different reasons? Sure. But to Barbara's very simple culture and geography lesson we had earlier, this is the place Franklin Starr would have encountered the Spanish language. He's not here very long. Most of what he's dealing with is in that law office, frankly. Yes, sir.
If the diary was lost and undiscovered for decades, how was it authenticated?
That's a great question. The question is, if it's gone for so long, how have people been able to authenticate it? I'm not a handwriting expert, but I would tell you most people that have weighed in on its authenticity have done so comparing it on a handwriting front. Travis was a prolific writer as a lawyer, as the secretary of the town council. We have a lot of evidence of Travis's writing, and many people who were exposed to it or have seen it in a contemporary way see it as a seamless thing. I believe that to be true from my review of it. Again, I'm in no way an expert on handwriting, but it looks pretty consistent to me. Interestingly, to your point, there's a fairly famous avocational historian who I think is a New York City firefighter, or used to be, named Bill Groneman, who had speculated that the diary could be a fake or a forgery, and particularly noted, I didn't tell you all this story earlier, it seems like, in maybe his more caddish moments, that when Travis was writing about relations with women, particularly sexual relations with women, he would use the Spanish language from time to time. So the diary is mostly in English, but there would be these Spanish phraseologies when he was counting up these conquests. And I believe Mr. Groneman at one point speculated the handwriting seemed different to him, that even if the diary were authentic, the addition of those Spanish language things seemed off. I've talked to people about it. I've looked at it myself. I find the handwriting to be very consistent, and many people who trust its authenticity do as well. So to Barbara's point about the Victorian era, there's nothing in the Starr family's history, I think, that would give much credence to them creating the diary as a result of the centennial coming up, right? So we're telling you the centennial may have been the magic button that helped them find a way to help preserve this document. I don't think there's anyone we know of in the Starr family who might have had more sinister motivations. Wow, I could make up this whole story. Not to mention, 100 years later, I doubt many of the Starr family had any serious knowledge about Franklin and Travis. I don't know.
You have to know everybody in San Felipe
Yeah.
and in the other towns too.
John, do you have a comment?
They donated the diary for free.
Sure.
There was no profit motive, right?
Well, they didn't need to make a profit.
Marilyn Lamar's papers passed down to his daughter.
Right.
And she sold them to the Texas legislature for $10,000.
Sure.
Yeah.
There's no evidence of any kind of financial transaction. The question was there a financial motivation for the Stars to move their
Should
stuff?
I tell them what Dr. Starr did for a living?
All right.
He was Dr. Starr and Frank, his son, joined him in a land office they bought and sold land. Yeah, sorry. I keep moving away. Huh? They bought and sold land and at one point the Starr and Son land company owned or had access to over 1 million acres in Texas. And the way Dr. Starr got started in Texas, because he had done this previously in other places he had lived in regard to buying land on speculation, more or less, is that he bought what was left over from, gosh, words have gone out of my brain, on land certificates, like soldiers that got certificates of land, like maybe for a league or a labor or 2 leagues or whatever. Well, some guys don't want 1,200 acres. You know, they just want like 50. And so they go get their 50 acres and have all that left over. Well, Dr. Starr would pay them in gold because it's in his diary that he paid in gold. So he's calling, like, some guys down here in Texas, he fought in the revolution. He's like, Texas too hot, I'm going back to, Kansas or whatever. And he go, oh, you know what, that guy, I know him, he's in Kansas. He'd write him a letter and say, would you like to sell the rest of your certificate to me? So they had access to land that was, that all over.
For people in Texas playing a long game with land speculation and acquisition, this is a very common thing. And it starts in the Footprints colony where, you have surveyors working with somebody who said they didn't have money to pay for a survey, and the surveyor would do to take a chop of the land, right? So they're doing different things to navigate who's going to own what. And in the case of the script, the veteran script particularly, if y'all are familiar with Dr. Stephen Hardin's work about the Texas Revolution story, he's most well known for a book called Texian Iliad, which is the history of the Texas Revolution. But he also wrote one of my favorite books of the era called Texian Macabre, which tells the story about a guy in Houston after independence living in the capital, who just as Barbara noted, came here as an adventuring soldier to Texas, gets here for the Battle of San Jacinto, has no interest in settling and being a farmer and being nothing. So Dr. Hardin does a nice job of talking about how these soldiers are trading these scripts for 640 acres for almost anything. You get down to value where you're getting a bottle of whiskey for it, just whatever you can get to move these pieces of paper because you have no interest in being a landholder in East Texas or whatever. One last trivia I wanted Barbara to comment on before we turn people loose. Harrison County is also named for
Jonas Harrison.
who has a connection to the Stars in San Felipe, right?
No, he has a connection to just the revolution.
All right, and San Augustine, is there a connection there? Yeah. A lot of folks from here ended up back in East Texas after the burning of the town. So San Augustine area, Nacogdoches, whatever. And so it's fun to find how these folks are all connected in various ways. For those of you at home, we're going to end the program. Thanks for participating. Oh, we got one more question? Yeah.
Travis diary was really important history for my family. My 2003 grandfather lived on the other side of the Brazos River and is mentioned 9 times in the William Travis diary.
Nice.
Joseph career.
Yeah.
And so that was a really spark-like moment when we found that information many years ago.
Sure.
And it maybe that leaves a little more credence into some of the questions somebody asked about, well, is it real or not? Well, I know where my 2 times great grandfather came from. He came from San Martinsville, Louisiana, then to Liberty County, and was in the 1826 Astonishing census.
Yep.
And in there they asked a question, would you be interested in coming to Stephen F. Austin's colony? And he said, no. And about 5 years later, he was here living, if you're familiar with the other side of the river, it's the mouth of Iron Creek, which is at the end of Clemens Switch Road, right outside of Patterson, Texas, is where his land was. And we have several documents that show that his son actually donated, if you're familiar with the railroad from Brookshire to Steely, he donated the land. And we've got some documents. The General Land Office have a lot of that information. And you were talking about description things. Well, my 2 times great grandfather was what I would call a quartermaster in the Texas Revolutionary War. Probably had cows, and he probably sold them, and in some way or another, the General Land Office, there's 20 or 30 different ways that he got paid through the government for his cows or his wagons or mules or whatever. And so the Travis Diary, it's amazing that it exists in any form or fashion, but it was really something that gave us some really important information for my family.
I appreciate you sharing that. And I would also say that is a great point to the authenticity question that you bring up, because the people that Travis references are not people that you're going to find in a Texas history book. They're not people that you would easily go root out. If you're going to make this fake document, you'd have to be pretty intimately familiar with who's living where and what they're doing and who's on a popular route. You know, Travis is following a circuit for the law, and he's on what were the major roadways of the time. So he knew who had a house on a corner you could stop and spend the night if you're traveling late. Right.
In exchange for legal services.
Well, I certainly had no role in your family finding this great discovery, but I'll tell you, operating a place like this, you can imagine we get a lot of visitors that are on their own genealogical journey. And in some cases, their family started it years ago, closer to the centennial, because they were trying to make their connections for SRT and DRT to some of these early stories. But in the modern era, where online research makes it easier and access to collections, the General Land Office has one of the best digitized collections of anybody. So if you're looking for stuff in state holdings related to land claims, they're probably going to be able to make it available to you. But I often tell people, if you're looking for the story and you really think you've got somebody who lived in this town, which we're always excited about engaging those folks, it's worth taking a perusal through something like the Travis Diary, because there may be an obscure reference to someone that you're connected to that could be a real moment of celebration for people.